So ContraPoints uploaded a video talking about gender-critical feminists. I've been wanting to respond to many of the things Contra has been saying for a while. I've been wanting to respond to many of the things many people have said on this platform for a very long time. Every day, I remember a video that I want to do but still haven't done. This video can be taken as a sequel to some videos I made regarding Sean a couple of months ago, responding to him on transphobia in the UK in 2 parts and then responding to his fans in another video, creating a nice little self-contained trilogy. And since this response is going to be 2 parts, and I would expect some interesting comments here as well, maybe this will be another trilogy. However, I am going to do a few things differently. I'm going to try and be very nice, friendly, respectful. I'm going to be a bit more 1 Corinthians 13 in my day-to-day life, maybe even a bit of Romans 12. It's in this spirit that I'm going to refer to ContraPoints as Natalie, and I'm going to use female pronouns. Now, this isn't because I think she's a woman. The reason I'm making this decision is because I don't want Natalie, if she ever watches this, to feel worse about herself. I don't want to upset her. As I said in a previous video, I don't want to be the reason why trans people feel sad or angry. Now, maybe some people, including Natalie, will say this is insincere, since I don't actually believe she is a woman. Maybe some women who have been genuinely hurt by transgender identity politics will say I'm capitulating to something that is quite harmful. The point is that no matter what I do, people are going to be upset. So I've made a call to err on the side of what feels kinder and more loving. And since I'm calling Natalie Natalie as opposed to ContraPoints, I'll just say that my name's Michael, not King Arpharazon. So yeah.
On the day that the female eunuch was issued in America, a person in flapping draperies rushed up to me and grabbed my hand.
Thank you.
It breathed hoarsely.
Thank you so much for all you've done for us, girls.
I smirked and nodded and stepped backward, trying to extricate my hand from the enormous, knuckly, hairy, beringed paw that clutched it. The face staring into mine was thickly coated with a pancake makeup through which the stubble was already burgeoning, in futile competition with a Dynel wig of immense luxuriance, and 2 pairs of false eyelashes, against the bony ribs that could be counted through its flimsy scarf dress swung a polished steel women's liberation emblem. I should have said, "You're a man. The female eunuch has done less than nothing for you. Piss off."
Now, one of the reasons I'm trying to be respectful is not just because it's the right thing to do, but because I think Natalie herself seems to make an effort to reach across the aisle. I'm honestly past all the hatred and anger in this debate, so any effort I can make to reciprocate Natalie's more civil tone in this discussion is what I will do. However, I have to point out that this is poisoning the well. She's taking one particular statement by one particular feminist, probably when they were in a very particular state of mind, and using that to set the tone for this whole discussion. It would be like if I started off this video by listing all the horrible, abusive things that trans people say about gender-critical feminists, when instead I'm saving that for later.
You know, these fanatics like Jermaine Greer who call trans women it and think trans men are lost lesbian sisters.
In a discussion, it's always good to start off by defining terms. Here we have Natalie define gender-critical people by the fact that they call trans people it. Now, I've never done that, so this isn't a good definition, and unfortunately is another example of the world being poisoned. I believe that Natalie is doing this to try and be funny. I believe it's tongue-in-cheek. I believe most of what Natalie does is dripping in irony. However, the thing she's doing right now causes real harm in the lives of many women. There are women who get death threats just for their concerns about the erosion of female-only spaces and other issues. And by defining these people by the possibility that they may use dehumanizing language to trans people rather than by what they actually believe, Natalie is contributing to that.
You guys do know about trans men, right? Male to female is not the only type of transgender person.
This is constantly brought up, and I refuse to believe Natalie doesn't know the answer to this. Ironically, the fact that gender-critical people don't talk about trans men is evidence that it's inaccurate to accuse gender-critical people of being transphobes or anti-trans. Gender-critical feminists are principally concerned with the negative effects that transgender identity politics has on women, and that mostly relates to the actions, rhetoric, and assumptions surrounding trans women. If gender-critical feminists just hated trans people, we'd expect them to have issues with trans men just as much as trans women. But instead we find that they focus more on trans women, which is exactly what we'd expect if the motivations of gender-critical feminists have nothing to do with hating trans people and everything to do with protecting women.
In the past on this channel, I've always caricatured TERFs as being like angry, man-hating bigots whose only real tactic is accusing trans women of being creepy men. And there definitely are some people who are really like that.
First of all, if gender-critical feminists were man-hating bigots, that wouldn't particularly matter. Hating men is a reasonable response to the past couple of thousand years of human history. The obligation isn't on women to let systemic patriarchal oppression slide and sing kumbaya with guys, and is instead 100% on men to actually challenge the systemic patriarchal oppression that masculine and male privilege enables. But regardless of all this, gender-critical feminists definitively are not man-hating. The evidence of this can be found in the huge amounts of support I get from women whenever I talk about gender politics. The sole contributor to my Patreon is a woman, which means that 100% of the people who care about what I have to say enough to fund it are women. So I'm not really seeing the man hatred.
In preparation to make this video, I posted an invitation to Twitter asking people who used to be gender-critical feminists to share their stories with me.
Personally, I'm skeptical of the utility of asking people who used to subscribe to ideologies about said ideologies, as if that validates their opinion in some way. Case in point, you ever spoken to an ex-atheist? 9 times out of 10, they talk about how being an atheist was terrible and awful and they hated everyone, and many of them will unironically say that they hated the God they supposedly didn't even believe in. And ex-Christians aren't that much better. They will often reduce Christianity down to their own personal fundamentalist upbringing and experiences with individual Christians. The point is, people who used to belong to a given ideology won't necessarily have the most nuanced or informed idea of that ideology. Oftentimes, I find that it's the opposite. I suppose this is why I should bring up the obvious fact that there are current gender-critical feminists that Natalie could engage, but whatever.
And who at one time found comfort in a rigid view of gender where women and men are completely separate species, where women are safe and men are dangerous.
What's the world coming to when you can't even engage in violent oppression of a particular class of people since time immemorial without being considered violent? Again, we have this idea that gender-critical feminism is defined by hating men. Now, if I were trying to show that my position wasn't attempting to delegitimize, undermine, or otherwise erase women's issues, I probably wouldn't make a very significant part of my criticism of those who oppose my position focus on how mean they are to men. Because accusing feminists of misandry is not a tactic I associate with people who are on the right side of history. And men are dangerous. If a woman who only knew me moderately well didn't want me in a room alone with her, I'd be like, fair enough. I'm a big guy. I've got an intense stare, and male feminists don't exactly have a great reputation when it comes to not being awful people. Now yes, not 100% of men are violent, but most, if not all men, are socialized to be violent and entitled and dismissive towards women. I don't think any gender-critical feminists believe 100% of men are violent though. However, back in my day there was something called Schrodinger's rapist, based on the concept of Schrodinger's cat. It posits that you can't know whether or not a man presents a threat to you until you find out that he does. I can say that I respect women and I'm very chivalrous and that I'm such a loving guy to my significant other. However, there is no way to differentiate between me saying that and that exact same thing being said by a guy who is abusive and is predatory. So yes, a fairly legitimate cause for concern.
Allowing trans people into their picture of the world at first challenged their sense of stability and comfort.
This almost positions gender-critical people as closed-minded, who can't handle the way that trans people challenge their rigid notions of gender. In reality, gender-critical people are concerned that trans identity politics will often carry with it the implication that there is no meaningful distinction between people raised as one gender and people raised as the other. However, in reality, there does seem to be a distinction. A lot of trans women act much more like men than they do like women, harassing people, sending them death threats, feeling entitled to approval. These are all much more in keeping with the mentality of men than of women. I've debated women and I've debated men. The experiences are very different. Men are much quicker to shout people down. Men are much quicker to condescend. Men are much quicker to undermine the integrity of the person they're arguing with. In my by no means limited experience discussing with trans women, I've found their behavior to be perfectly in step with the behavior of most men. Take this as a small example of a larger reality. Being socialized as a man with a penis does affect somebody. When you are subject to, at best, objectionable microaggressions in the way you are treated, and at worst, actual acts of violence almost entirely by people of one gender, then the fact that people who decide at a later point that they are in fact another gender continue, nonetheless, to reflect their biological gender in their behavior is a serious problem. The fact that somebody might assert that they belong in your space despite bringing with them much of the socialization that made your own private space necessary in the first place, is a perfectly reasonable thing to feel anxious about and oppose.
So it's not just evil bigots who are attracted to the gender-critical worldview.
In my experience, it's mostly not that, although I will admit there are people who hate trans people within the gender-critical movement. Having said that, I'm not in the business of policing the emotions of oppressed groups.
I want to really engage with gender-critical ideas in the public arena of free speech, open communication, dialogue, conversation, debate, idea, marketplace, expression, discourse.
So I will accept that all of the not very good things that Natalie has said so far are supposed to be taken with a grain of salt, even while they make the conversation more toxic and reinforce ideas that harm women. I'll accept all of her undermining of the gender-critical position as a joke. I'll continue to accept that she wants to have an open discussion, even as she sounds insincere as she says it. Like I say, there are layers of irony to unpack here.
You know, it's like you're not even allowed to ask questions anymore, or you're accused of transphobia. We're all just expected to conform to this gender ideology.
It's important to note that, despite betraying this position as wrong via the over-the-top straw feminist, Natalie never actually denies this. Instead, she justifies it.
Trans people don't like engaging with these questions because most of the time they're just brandished as weapons against us.
She says that trans people have to deal with insincere people asking questions, so of course they're allowed to attack people for asking questions. Although, I don't think I present myself as a concern troll. In contexts where it's been very clear where I'm coming from, and that I'm not coming from a place of hatred, mockery, or insincerity, I'm still attacked for asking questions. Okay, sure, if some random person on Twitter starts interrogating trans people just for being trans, you're within your right to not have that conversation. In general, you never owe anybody a debate or an explanation. However, if you come into the discussion with demands concerning women's spaces, then you don't really get to declare that you don't owe women an explanation as you're entering their spaces. More to the point though, if somebody says that they have concerns about trans identity politics out into the ether, say they make a tweet about it addressed to nobody, you don't have to jump in and defend against all their objections. You can ignore it. What you shouldn't do is jump down their throat and call them all sorts of horrible names. There's a difference between not feeding the trolls and not entertaining sincere objections. And there's a difference between declining to explain yourself to somebody and attacking somebody for stating their opinion. And there's a difference between minding your own business and forcing your way into women's spaces. You're trying to justify the latter in each case by explaining how the former is justified.
High rates of family rejection and mistreatment puts trans people on the defensive.
Somebody find me a TERF. I'm mad and ready to fistfight. I will kill all TERFs with my sword of absolute power. Punch a TERF, y'all. I will punch the shit out of the TERF who reports you. Can somebody lob a brick at the TERF twats? If every TERF on the planet could set themselves on fire, that would be appreciated. I will knock you down with my toothpick body. Stab your local TERF. Step the fuck up and take out the TERF trash. Get in their faces. Make them afraid. Kill a TERF. I will fuck up a TERF on sight. Oh, it's that kind of oppression where you are constantly threatening to assault women and making them feel afraid to voice their objections. That's actually my favourite kind of oppression, where all the aggression is coming from one side and they're the ones who are apparently the victims.
We have far-right politicians menacing us with legal discrimination and erasure. We have
right-wing politicians aren't using gender-critical talking points, and even if they were, that would be useless since they clearly don't advocate for a gender-critical position. I'm not aware of Ben Shapiro busting out any Janice Raymond, or Jordan Peterson whipping out some Andrea Dworkin, or Mike Pence quoting Jermaine Greer. And maybe it happens, but people who act as if far-right people appropriating gender-critical rhetoric is a serious problem remind me of people who think feminists who want to kill all men infiltrating feminism is a problem. Except it's even more stupid since gender-critical theory contradicts every single thing that right-wing gender politics stands for. Gender-critical notions cannot evolve from transphobia, since transphobia is rooted in a hatred of gender non-conforming individuals, while gender-critical theory, being all about criticizing gender, champions gender non-conforming individuals. Gender-critical notions evolve from feminism, since feminism is rooted in protecting the rights of women and ensuring that women's issues are addressed. And it's increasingly obvious to many that trans identity politics is directly contradicting that.
I'm kind of an unorthodox trans person, so much for the unquestionable dogma of the trans cult.
I get this is a joke, but it's important to understand that somebody who is very clearly pro-trans and has repeatedly attacked gender-critical feminists will be given some leeway when it comes to varying from the established narrative. However, If you aren't clearly designated as a trans ally, well then you're basically fucked if you disagree even slightly. Since I'm not immediately obvious as a trans ally, me simply saying that we should engage gender critical feminists in debate back in the summer of 2017 was met with attacks from my trans subscribers. Aside from that, you even have people like Miranda Yardley, a trans woman who said that trans women aren't women, who was arrested and put on trial for transphobia. So yes, welcome to the trans cult. The cult that will support trans women being arrested if they don't accept that being trans causes them to in fact become women.
My clothes, makeup, voice, none of this makes me a woman. Rather, we're using a cultural language of feminine signifiers to prompt others to see us for what we are. But also, if one person calls me sir, that's gonna ruin my day. So I'm desperately throwing glitter spaghetti at the wall in hopes the light catches some glimmer of womanhood.
You are dressing more feminine than you want to in order for society to accept you as a woman, while at the same time complaining that gender critical feminists are the ones constricting your gender expression. It seems to me like you're much more constrained having to present an overly feminine image to appease a society that does not largely accept gender non-conforming people. Wanting to present yourself to be more in line with whatever gender you consider yourself to be is a pretty universal human experience. The disagreement is that gender-critical feminists see the problem there to be gender itself and the idea that we should meaningfully consider ourselves to be any given gender at all. Meanwhile, for you, the problem is that you don't want to be misgendered, so you're basically forced to perpetually present yourself as hyper-feminine. It's also worth noting that your present arrangement totally contradicts the end goals of gender-critical feminists. Gender-critical feminists want a world of total gender non-conformity, where the decision to wear makeup or have long hair or wear dresses becomes totally detached from somebody's gender. However, in that situation, you'd be fucked, since you cling to gender signifiers as a means to ensure that people refer to you by the gender you consider yourself to be.
I've had to fight against the same society that told me I should really not be this. So I feel like we should be able to form some kind of solidarity here.
Do you think it's gender-critical people who are opposed to solidarity? In my experience, pretty much every gender-critical feminist believes liberal feminists and themselves to be on the same side against conservatives, reactionaries, fascists, and those liberals who basically use liberalism as an excuse to support the worst parts of the status quo. By contrast, it's liberal feminists / trans activists / genderists who are constantly positioning TERFs as enemies alongside the aforementioned various shitty groups. I view you, Natalie, to be on my side on most of the important issues. I'm sure most gender-critical feminists feel the exact same way. The group that considers us to be fundamentally at odds with each other is your ilk.
So what I'm going to do is just hold my hands up genderlessly and speak in a genderless robot voice. My name is 5466417. I have no gender. Patriarchy is over.
There's a big difference between abolishing gender signifiers and abolishing gender. If you've ever had to defend your sola scriptura position against a Catholic, then you'll of course be familiar with arguing against the claim, what about Christmas, huh? That's a tradition, why do you do that? At which point you have to explain that doing something because you want to is utterly distinct from doing something because you think it's an expression of something meaningful. I think you know, Natalie, that nobody is saying that we should all be devoid of any conventional gender signifiers. Instead, the argument is that we should no longer consider those things to be gender signifiers. Nobody has a problem with you adopting lots of traditionally feminine gender signifiers and not considering yourself to be a woman, except for conservative transphobes, but fuck them. Indeed, if you are exactly the same in every way, except that you accepted that you weren't a woman, gender-critical people would consider you a fantastic example of a gender non-conforming person. The problem is, you aren't gender non-conforming, since you consider yourself to be a woman, and you most definitely conform to being a woman. That's the problem. It's not that you wear a dress or makeup, or even that you talk with a slightly more feminine voice.
And denying trans people their gender identity because abolish gender is kind of like denying citizenship to immigrants because abolish borders.
This is a very interesting analogy. However, as with all analogies, it's better as an illustration than an argument. Admittedly, part of the reason I'm referring to you by your preferred pronouns is because, yeah, it isn't your fault that we live in a society with fucked up ideas about gender. However, you are incredibly dismissive towards the idea of abolishing gender here.
Your utopian pipe dream is valid.
Like for you, gender isn't really an issue, because you look like a woman and consider yourself to be a woman. Well done you.
I can't stand this, fuck this.
But what about the people out there who look like women and don't consider themselves to be women? Who's looking out for them? See, what we have right now is a situation where there's a group of people, gender critical feminists, who are totally down with and respectful towards gender non-conforming people. These gender-critical feminists are all about abolishing gender and making it so everybody can be gender non-conforming without it even being of note. However, There are another group of gender non-conforming people who have decided that they are in fact members of the opposite gender. And gender critical feminists say, okay, but I mean, that doesn't really gel with the whole abolishing gender thing. And then many of these people and their allies say, shut up and burn to death, TERF. And you're presenting this as just the simple, practical way you have got to be. Why can't the practical way be that you say you're a woman, I say I don't think you're a woman, and we both work together as allies to make it so ultimately the question of whether you are or are not a woman matters less and less. The answer to that question seems to be that for you, that you are a woman matters a lot. It matters so much that this question is going to form a rift between us that cannot be crossed, just like in Luke 16:26. Now, I'm not going to address the immigration comparison directly because, as I say, these analogies don't really function well as genuine arguments since immigration and gender are completely different topics. Although, if I were to engage in the analogy, I would say it's more like if we said that all people are citizens of the world and their country of origin doesn't matter, rather than the way you present it with the evil mean TERF saying, you aren't allowed in our country.
You know, you don't see gender-critical feminists in Kim Kardashian's Instagram comments like, why are you wearing a dress, Kim, you creepy misogynist? You should be abolishing gender, not reinforcing stereotypes designed to oppress women. No.
First of all, anybody attacking people in the comment section to their social media posts about unrelated topics should stop that. However, yeah, women do some bad things that perpetuate negative ideas about women, and they are called out for that. But as I've already said, the problem isn't stereotypical gender signifiers, the problem is when those signifiers are used for the sake of gender expression. Also, it has to be said, as somebody socialized as a woman, she is most definitely a victim of patriarchy and internalized misogyny. By contrast, somebody who was raised most of their life as a man, who has decided now to call themselves a woman, is much less concretely a victim of patriarchy. Now, to an extent, we all do get affected negatively by patriarchy, but there's a difference between being negatively affected by a thing and being a victim of that thing.
It's almost like this is a hate movement hiding behind a handful of pseudo-feminist platitudes. But surely, I must be missing something.
You really aren't good at the whole trying to take people at face value thing, are you? I mean, I really want to give you all due respect for being slightly more civil than most people on your side of the debate. However, I think I'm giving you more than your due respect considering how many times you've implied that I'm just hateful.
It's just bizarre to me that they think that. Like, what do you think my experience in the world is? You think men treat me as their equal? You think street harassers are gonna treat me with dignity and respect because I have a Y chromosome?
I don't think any significant number of people think that trans people don't face any oppression. Indeed, depending on a variety of factors, they may face oppression for being gender non-conforming, or they may actually face oppression equivalent to the oppression faced by women, or at least closely paralleled by it. If anybody says this isn't the case, I would call them out for it, or at least, ask why they think that. I would also say that male privilege is distinct from masculine privilege. There are certain privileges I have as a tall guy with a broad build who enjoys football and is, straight. These are privileges not shared by short, skinny guys who like, say, anime and are gay. However, we both have privileges attached to our biology, and that privilege will manifest itself. As I've said, I'm a long way from being convinced that this male privilege doesn't remain more often than not when somebody with a penis decides that they are a woman. When it comes to gender, Natalie is much less privileged than me. I wouldn't deny that for a second. However, that isn't to say that Natalie therefore lacks any male privilege. Since Natalie mentioned trans men at the beginning, I'm going to come full circle. Something I've noticed is that trans men are often not taken seriously as men. They're kind of written off as women who are trying to be one of the guys. They're attacked for being overly emotional and hormonal as well. Often they are intensely sexualized based on the fact that they have a vagina and could therefore be put in their place by quote-unquote real men. This is to say that trans men will often still be subject to a lot of biological criticisms based on sexist ideas about women's bodies. The biological privileges of men are, I believe, slightly more subtle than the biological oppressions of women, but I don't think it would be misguided to expect a parallel. Indeed, as I said earlier on, I see plenty of evidence that many trans women activists are just oozing with male entitlement and other male privilege.
I know some of you are going to sneak off to your shitty little radfem forums and obsess over how manly and cloggable I am.
I just wanted to say, not that it matters, but Natalie does pass as a woman. Anyway, so that's it. We're halfway through. If you want to watch part 2, then subscribe. If you like. If you dislike, please do leave comments below. However, I should just say that if you use abusive language, I'll ask you to edit your comment. And if you don't edit it, then I'll remove your comment. Obviously, if it's just abuse, then I'll just delete it. But if you, make a comment that's generally quite good, but you use the word, turf or something, then I'll ask you to edit it. Please share this video with your friends also. Lots of love to you. Oh, and I have a Twitter and a Patreon. Links to that below. And thank you to my Patreon supporter, Hannah Taylor. Good stuff.
Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can!